Today's lecture will be divided into 4 parts. It will cover the period from 1968 to 1980, and therefore look at the presidencies of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. Now, as discussed in the previous lecture, there were numerous political divisions in the 1960s. And ultimately this led to a lot of social divisions as well. People really lost hope of reuniting as a society with common interests and goals. Instead, many focused on issues of significance to the subgroups which they belonged to. For example, the hippies focused on anti-war, equal rights, existentialism, etc. And one group which was very significant and which the hippies actually borrowed from during this period were the Native Americans. During this period, many Indians sought to maintain their culture or retrieve elements that they had lost in the previous decades or centuries. And in 1968, a group of Indian activists, including Dennis Banks, George Mitchell, and Clyde Bellencourt, convened a group of about 200 people in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and formed what was known as the American Indian Movement, or AIM for short. Now, it's noteworthy that the organizers were urban city dwellers, and they were really frustrated by the decades of poverty and discrimination which manifested itself within the Indian communities, both in rural and urban locations. Some ideas some points which give you an idea about this. In 1970, the average life expectancy of Indians in America was actually 46 years old, compared to the national average of 69 for everyone else. They had twice the suicide rate of the rest of the United States. The infant mortality in Indian communities was highest in the countries. Half of the Indians lived on reservations, and they had 50% unemployment on reservations. And in cities, many Indians lived 20% below the poverty line. As a result of this, AIM engaged in numerous demonstrations to try to bring attention to the plight of the Indians. One such demonstration was at Alcatraz, off of the San Francisco coast, in which they actually occupied the island to promote their causes, and this lasted for 19 months. In 1972, AIM members also marched on Washington. This was called the Trail of Broken Treaties, which is a play on words for the Trail of Tears. And once they arrived in Washington, they occupied the offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And here they presented a list of demands to the American people, including improved housing, education, and economic opportunities in Indian communities. And they also wanted new treaties between the United States and the reservations, the return of Indian lands, and protections for native religions and culture. Here is a picture of the March on Washington. You can see that a teepee is set up outside of the Washington Monument. And on the other side is a picture of the AIM flag. Now, the most dramatic event which AIM did during this period was the occupation of the Indians' reservation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, in February 1973. Now, it's noteworthy that Wounded Knee, as I'm sure you remember from a previous lecture, was the site of the 1890 massacre of members of the Lakota tribe by the U.S. Army. And AIM went to the reservation after the failure of the tribe known as Oglala to impeach the tribal president, Dick Wilson, who was accused of corruption and strong-arm tactics, which he used to silence critics in the tribe. Basically, what AIM wanted to do is to force this individual to leave the reservation. It was not politically oriented at first, but once they arrived, they did use the opportunity to criticize the government for failing to live up to the treaties, and they ended up occupying and controlling the reservation from this point forward. Now, the U.S. government was not happy about this, and they surrounded the reservation with U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, and other law enforcers, and actually staged a siege on the reservation, which lasted for 71 days. Now, during their siege, there was gunfire from both sides, and a U.S. Marshal, and FBI agent were actually wounded during this, and 2 Indians were actually killed as well. Now, it's noteworthy that the government, even after this, did little to meet the demands of the protesters. In fact, 2 leaders of the occupation of the reservation, who were named Dennis Banks and Russell Means, were actually arrested, but later on the charges were dismissed. However, it's noteworthy that the Nixon administration, which was in charge during this period, had already halted the federal policy of termination, had restored millions of acres to the tribes already, and as a result of this, they also increased funding for Indian education, healthcare, housing, and many other things which resulted from this occupation. Now, apart from the Indians, women were also making strides during this period, and the feminist push for greater rights continued throughout the 1970s. Now, it's noteworthy that the media ridiculed feminists during this period as women's libers, which is short for women's liberators. And the media in particular focused on radical organizations such as WITCH, W-I-T-C-H, also known as the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. This was a loose association of activists, and a majority of them really focused on very insignificant accomplishments, insignificant goals. However, a majority of feminists during this period who were not a focus of the media really sought out more meaningful accomplishments. For example, in the 1970s, a number of women's organizations opened up battered women's shelters for women which were the victim of domestic abuse. They successfully fought protection from employment discrimination for pregnant women. They pushed to reform rape laws in the United States. They actually their movement led to the criminalization of domestic violence. And they also received funding for schools that sought to counter sexist stereotypes of women within the curriculum in schools. Now, one of the most noteworthy movements during this period as well, or the result of something during this period as well, was the U.S. Supreme Court resolution in the Roe versus Wade case, which affirmed a number of state laws during this period under which abortions obtained during the first 3 months of a pregnancy were legal. Now, essentially what this did was it made non-therapeutic abortion legal in a number of, or all over the nation, and it also made it a legal medical procedure. Now, here is the March on Washington in 1970, which was one of the meaningful things that the women's liberation movement did during this period. And there were also a number of other achievements by women during this period as well, particularly in the area of politics. Now, one such individual who was extremely influential in the political realm during this period was a woman by the name of Patsy Mink. And it's noteworthy that Patsy was actually the first Asian American woman elected to Congress. And she also co-authored an extremely important act, namely the Education Amendments Act of 1972. And Title IX of this act prohibited sexual discrimination in education. And most of you might be familiar with this because this provided equal funding and equal scholarships for women's sports in universities. Another significant political institution during this period was the National Women's Political Caucus, or the NWPC. And this also helped many women enter politics during this period. It was formed in 1971 by Bella Abzug Gloria Steinem, Shirley Chisholm, and other feminists. And the purpose was to encourage women's participation in political parties, to elect women to office, and also to raise money for campaigns. Now, it's also noteworthy that NOW, which we talked about in the last lecture, the National Organization for Women, also pushed during this period for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which we talked about before in relation to the suffrage movement in the early 20th century. And it's noteworthy that during this period, the Equal Rights Amendment actually passed Congress in March 1972, but it was not ratified by enough states and therefore failed. Now here's a picture of Patsy Mink and Bella Abzug, who we just talked about. Patsy Mink was the first Asian American woman elected to Congress, and Betsy Abzug was one of the founders of the National Women's Political Caucus, or the NWPC. Now, the election of 1968 revealed a rupture in the New Deal coalition that had come together under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Democrats were really divided during this period by internal dissension over Vietnam, civil rights, and the New Left, which we talked about in the last lecture. And the Republican candidate, who was Richard Nixon, won voters in the South and the Southwest, the northern suburbs, and other places by appealing to their anxieties about civil rights, women's rights, anti-war protests, and counterculture. And this is really when the Republican Party switches to be the party of the more conservative people, and the Democratic Party changes to be the party of minorities, such as African Americans, and other groups, is in this 1968 election. Now, during this period, Nixon employed a variety of strategies, but one such strategy was known as the Southern strategy. And in this strategy, he denounced segregation, but he also maintained that Southern states be allowed to pursue racial equality at their own pace, and he really criticized forced integration. By doing this, he gained the support of one of the most popular senators at the time, South Carolina's senior senator and avid segregationist, Strom Thurmond, who many of you might know, and this helped him win the Republican nomination. He also courted the Northern Blue Collars workers, who he later called the silent majority, and he acknowledged their beliefs and that their voices were seldom heard, and the voters which feared social changes taking place, such as the anti-war protests and other sorts of things, really liked what Nixon had to say with respect to that. Nixon ultimately promised stability and an emphasis on law and order during this period, really appealed to the blue-collar workers and individuals such as that, and he portrayed himself as a fervent patriot who would be willing to take a strong stand against racial unrest and anti-war protests. He also harshly criticized Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society during this period, which we talked about in the last lecture. And he also promised a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam honorably and bring home troops, which gained a lot of attention in the press and made him very popular. And finally, he championed suburbia and middle America during his campaign and really called the country to come together. As we discussed in the previous section, the country was very divided during this period. But he really called for the country to come together, and that was a main focus of his campaign. Now, it's noteworthy that Nixon nominated as his running mate Spiro T. Agnew, the former governor of Maryland. And the former governor of Maryland, Agnew, basically blasted the Democratic ticket as being fiscally irresponsible and soft on communism. And thus, by doing this, Nixon also appealed to northern middle class and blue-collar whites, as well as southern whites, who fled to the suburbs in the wake of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Here's a picture of Richard Nixon during this campaign, and also one of him bowling. Now, ultimately, the Democrats during the 1968 campaign nominated Hubert H. Humphrey, but the party by this point was very heavily divided. In fact, many loyal Democrat votes actually turned away from their party, as we discussed before, which seemed to have attracted radicals and hippies and other people that these more loyal Democrats did not like at the time. Now, Nixon easily won the Electoral College during the 1968 election, and this really forever changed the landscape of American politics, as we discussed before. But once he was elected, he started pursuing a policy of deliberate neglect of civil rights and the needs of ethnic minorities. Now, some examples of this were in 1969, for example, when federal lawyers sided with Mississippi when it sought to slow the pace of school desegregation. Basically, Nixon during this period saw that restricting African American activity was a way of undercutting a source of votes for the Democratic Party, and anything that he could do to do this, he tried during the period. And one key example of this was the fact that he sought to overhaul the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which Lyndon B. Johnson put into place. However, it is noteworthy that in economic areas, he did do some things to help African Americans and minorities in America. One noteworthy example of this was that he expanded affirmative action, and this was actually a program which Johnson began, and the idea was to improve employment and school opportunities for racial minorities. So Nixon did embrace this, but he actually worked counter to civil rights in a lot of ways as well. Now, despite Nixon's criticisms of the Great Society, he did actually embrace and expanded many of its features, particularly those related to the economy. In 1969, he actually signed a bill that eliminated the investment tax credit and basically moved some 2 million of the poorest people in America off the tax rolls in America altogether. So 2 million people in America did not have to pay taxes anymore after 1969. He also federalized the food stamp program, which was started during the Johnson administration. And he also signed into law automatic adjustments for inflation of the Social Security payments. One of the things that were not automatic prior to Nixon's doing of this were inflation-based adjustments, and he instituted this to provide more money for the elderly. On the other hand, however, he also won praise from fiscal conservatives with what was known as New Federalism, and that's the last point on this slide. Basically, what New Federalism was that he drastically expanded the use of federal block grants to states, large amounts of monies to states, which allowed them to basically go on a spending spree, and they were allowed to spend this money on whatever they wanted to, with no strings attached. So it really took the power away from the federal government, which was a very conservative move, and gave it back to the states and allowed the states to do with the money whatever they wanted to do. Now, by mid-1970, recession had began in the United States, and unemployment was actually at 6.2%, which was twice what it ever was during the Johnson administration. To deal with this problem, he approved deficit spending. However, basically, this didn't really do much because the new economic troubles were not just a matter of pumping money into the economy. For one, post-war development in Germany and Japan had created some serious competition for American businesses. They were no longer dominant in many areas or in many markets, particularly the automobile market. Another example, or another point which led to the recession during Nixon's administration, was the Yom Kippur War. Now, this was a war between Syria and Egypt against Israel. Essentially, the objective of this was that Egypt could recover territory which it lost in 1967, and the USSR supported Syria and Egypt, and the United States supported Israel. But by doing this, they actually earned the enmity of Arab nations, and in retaliation, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, imposed an oil embargo on oil shipments to the U.S. for about 6 months, from October 1973 to March 1974. Now, this had instant effects on oil prices in the U.S. It pushed oil up from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. The price of gasoline also went from 38 cents to 55 cents a gallon during this period. And this also affected other goods which were dependent on gas. And it's significant that even after this embargo ended, the prices didn't come down, so they stayed at the same prices. And the oil embargo ultimately had a very lasting impact on the U.S. economy and really underscored the nation's interdependency on both international politics and economic developments in a way that had not previously existed. Now, it's noteworthy that as a result of the oil embargo in particular, the U.S. consumers really panicked. As a result of this, there were limited purchases on gas at gas stations. Gas stations were often closed on Sundays. And to conserve oil, Congress actually reduced speed on interstate highways to 55 miles an hour during this period. And it's noteworthy that in the United States, it's also 55 miles an hour in many places, even today. Now, as I mentioned, even after the oil embargo ended, prices continued to rise, and inflation soared as well during this period to 12.2% by 1974. Here's some pictures from the gas stations during this period. You can see on the left side it says "Sorry, no gasoline," and then on the right side a sign. Green, the green flag means everyone welcome, the yellow flag only for commercial vehicles, and the red flag closed, no gas. Now, Nixon was also heavily involved in foreign politics during this period, and actually prioritized foreign policy over domestic issues. In fact, he preferred the bold and dramatic action that this arena would afford him. And in 1969, he announced a new Cold War principle known as the Nixon Doctrine. Now, the Nixon Doctrine was a policy whereby the U.S. would continue to assist its allies, but would not assume responsibility any longer for defending the entire non-communist world. Now, since there were also 4 primary economic rivals of the U.S. during this period, namely Western Europe, the Soviet Union, China, and Japan, Nixon also sought to pit these countries against each other. And Japan, in particular, under the Nixon administration, was forced to assume the burden of defending itself on its own. Now, in August of 1971, going along with this pitting countries against each other idea, Nixon played what was known as the China card, which basically abruptly reversed 2 decades of U.S. diplomatic sanctions against the country and also hostility to the communist regime in China. In fact, he announced that he would personally travel to Beijing during this period and meet Chairman Mao Zedong in February of 1972. Basically, by doing this, he hoped that opening up the Chinese government would prompt its bitter rival at the time, which was the Soviet Union, to compete for global influence and as a result seek a more productive relationship with the United States. Moreover, he also hoped that by establishing a friendly relationship with China, it would isolate North Vietnam and also ease the peace settlement which he promised to the American public during his campaign, and allow the United States to extract its troops from the war honorably and quickly. Now, concurring that the Soviet Union would be restrained from making any advancements in Asia, Nixon and the Chinese premier at the time, named Zhou Enlai, ended up signing a friendship treaty to basically prevent this from happening, to prevent any Soviet advancements in Asia. And basically, through this friendship treaty, they promised to work together towards establishing trade between the two nations, to protect each other in certain events, and eventually to fully establish diplomatic relations once again. Now here's a picture of Richard and his wife Patricia standing on the Great Wall of China during his visit in 1972. Now in May 1972, Nixon continued the strategy of pitting one communist nation against another. This time he traveled to Moscow to meet with the Soviet leader at the time, who was Leonid Brezhnev. And during this meeting, he discussed the policy of détente, which was basically a relaxation of tensions between their nations. And the result of this was the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT. And basically what this did was it limited each side to deploying only 2 anti-ballistic missile systems in their country. It also limited the number of nuclear missiles maintained by each country. And it's noteworthy that in 1974, a further protocol also reduced anti-ballistic missiles to 1 per country. And there was also a signed agreement, or a series of signed agreements, to allow scientific and technological exchanges. And there was also a promise to work towards a joint space mission, which ultimately culminated in the International Space Station, which we have today. Now this brings us to the third part of the lecture, namely Vietnam and the Vietnam War, and the events which ultimately led to the end of the war. Now, one of the prime examples of something that went wrong in the Vietnam War was My Lai. And basically this was a result of a series of things, but it's noteworthy that during Vietnam, racism on the part of some US soldiers and a desire to retaliate against those they perceived to be responsible for harming US troops really affected the conduct of war. During the war, they burned villages suspected of shielding Viet Cong fighters, who were the militant group that fought on behalf of the North Vietnamese government. They also shot farmers' water buffalo for target practice during this period. And they also used napalm. And we discussed napalm previously, but napalm was essentially a jellied gasoline that sticked to objects as it burned. And it was commonly directed towards human beings during this period as well. Now, one of the most notorious examples of racism on the part of US soldiers and also the desire to retaliate was on March 16, 1968, in which men from the US Army's 23rd Infantry Division were sent to destroy the village of My Lai, which we discussed previously, which was suspected of hiding Viet Cong fighters. Now, the platoon leaders who were in charge of this believed that the order of Captain Ernest Medina, who was in charge of this region, was to destroy the enemy, and they believed that this order included killing women and children, though it's unclear what the actual order was. Now, one of the platoons, and actually this group in particular, suffered 28 casualties in the past 3 months, and men of the Charlie Company was under severe stress and were really apprehensive as they approached the village. Now, 2 platoons entered and started shooting randomly at the people. After that, 70 to 80 unarmed people were gathered together, and these included women, children, and infants. And they were forced into an irrigation ditch by members of the 1st Platoon under Lieutenant William L. Colley, Jr. After that, they were shot within the trench. Their houses were set on fire. But U.S. troops were never fired upon during this engagement. And one soldier actually testified that he didn't see any man who looked like a Viet Cong fighter in My Lai. The number of total civilians killed during this engagement is unclear, but historians estimate that it was between 347 and 504 people, and none of them were armed. Now here are the civilians at My Lai, and this photograph was taken moments before they were slaughtered in the village. Now the cover-up of this event began almost immediately. The army actually claimed that 150 died during the event, and it said that the majority of them were Viet Cong who were killed during a firefight. Now, hearing details from friends in the Charlie Company, a helicopter gunner named Ron Ridenour began to conduct his own investigation of what happened because he wasn't physically present, but he was very, very shocked by hearing what his friends in the Charlie Company had told him. And in April 1969, he wrote to 30 members of Congress demanding a formal investigation of what happened in My Lai. In September 1969, the Army actually charged Lieutenant Colley, who I mentioned before, was in charge of the events there, with premeditated murder. And many Americans became horrified by the graphic violence that they witnessed in the footage of the massacre, and it really confirmed their belief that the war was unjust and that it was not being fought on behalf of the Vietnamese people, but was being fought for American reasons. Now, Calley was ultimately found guilty in March 1971, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But when hundreds of thousands of people joined a Free Calley campaign in the United States, so clearly not everyone was dissatisfied or fed up with the war. And as a result of this pressure, 2 days later, President Nixon actually released Calley from prison, from custody, and placed him under house arrest in Fort Benning, Georgia. Now, 1 year later, Calley's sentence was reduced to 20 years. And later on in September 1974, he was paroled officially. And it's noteworthy that only one soldier was convicted in the massacre, and he spent a total of 3.5 years under house arrest. Now, as the conflict wore on and the reports of brutalities like My Lai and others increased, the anti-war movement really grew in strength, and Nixon wanted to get out of the war with honor as soon as possible, and he began the process of what he called Vietnamization, which was basically turning more responsibility for the war over to the South Vietnamese by training them and providing them with American weapons, guns, etc., while withdrawing U.S. troops from the battlefield itself. At the same time, however, Nixon also authorized the bombing of Cambodia, which had actually declared its neutrality during the period and was the neighbor of Vietnam, in order to destroy Viet Cong bases within the country and attempt to cut off supply routes, which had basically avoided South Vietnam by passing through Cambodia. Now, the bombing was ultimately kept secret from Congress and the American public. However, in April 1970, Nixon decided to follow up the bombing with an actual invasion of Cambodia itself. Now, when Nixon announced it, protests sprang up immediately all over the country and really created a mess in the United States. Now, one of the most tragic and politically damaging of these protests occurred or began on May 1st, 1970 at Kent State University in Ohio. Now, at Kent State, violence erupted in the town of Kent after a student demonstration on campus. And as a result of the violence in the town, the next day the mayor of Kent asked Ohio's governor at the time to send the National Guard to Kent to restore order. Now, troops were sent to the campus where the students had actually set fire to the ROTC building and were fighting firemen and policemen to try and extinguish it. The National Guard also used tear gas, and several students were arrested during this event. However, the tensions really came to a head on May 4th. On May 4th, 1,500 to about 2,000 students, the number is unclear, but they assembled once again on campus and started throwing rocks at a security officer who told them to leave. Now, after this, 77 members of the National Guard arrived with bayonets on their rifles, and they forced most of the students to retreat. However, after this, the troops started to retreat as well, but for some reason which remains unknown, they halted, turned, and began to fire on the students. During this firing, 9 were wounded, but 4 were actually killed during the engagement, and 2 of the dead were actually not involved in the protest itself, but were simply crossing the campus on the way to class. Now, eventually, peace was restored when a faculty member pleaded with the remaining students to leave. However, the news really shocked the country, and millions of students refused to attend classes in universities across America in the wake of the event. And on May 9th, 100,000 protesters assembled in Washington to protest not only the war, but what happened in Kent State. Now, it's noteworthy that a similar tragedy also happened on May 15th in the wake of the Kent State University tragedy. And this time it happened at Jackson State College, which was an African-American college in Jackson, Mississippi. Basically, this protest, like the Kent protest, protested the invasion of Cambodia, and they began throwing rocks and setting fires on campus. The police ultimately arrived and shortly after midnight opened fire with shotguns on the protesters. 12 were wounded and 2 young men were killed, one of which was actually a teenager from the region. Now, here on the left side is a picture of Nixon demonstrating or showing what will happen in the Cambodia siege, or the Cambodia invasion. And on the right are the tanks and the National Guard at Kent State University. Now, understanding the nation's mood in the wake of all of these protest demonstrations and the violence which occurred in these regions, Nixon ultimately dropped his opposition to a repeal of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964. We talked about this previously. Basically, this gave complete military authorization to the president and did not allow or did not force the president to get congressional permission to use military force. And in January 1971, Nixon actually signed Congress's revocation of the notorious blanket military authorization declaration. And the Gallup polls in May of 1971, shortly after this, said that only 28% of the people in America supported the war, and many felt that the war was not only a mistake, but was actually immoral. Now, another thing which was very influential in turning people against the war were what were known as the Pentagon Papers. Now, these were published in June of 1971, and they were excerpts from a study prepared during the Johnson administration that revealed the true nature of the conflict in Vietnam. And in these papers, the public learned that the U.S. had been planning to oust Now Dinh Diem from the South Vietnamese government, who, as we discussed before, was assassinated along with his brother, and that Johnson meant to expand the United States' role in Vietnam and bomb the North Vietnamese, even when he stated publicly that he had no intentions of doing so. The papers also said that the administration sought to deliberately provoke the North Vietnamese attacks to justify the American involvement in the conflict. And copies of these Pentagon Papers were ultimately given to the New York Times and other newspapers by a man by the name of Daniel Ellsberg, who was one of the military analysts who actually contributed to the papers itself. Now, after their publication, Nixon's district or attorney general, whose name was John Mitchell, sought an injunction against the New York Times to prevent the publication of future articles based on the Pentagon Papers. But the newspaper appealed, and in June of 1971, the Supreme Court actually held that the government could not prevent the publication of future articles relating to the paper, so there was free game, and this ultimately created a lot more anti-Vietnam War sentiment in the United States, and Nixon, as a direct result of this, started maneuvering to secure peace terms immediately. Now, it's noteworthy at this point that North Vietnam was willing to negotiate as a result of pressure put on them by China and the Soviet Union. And as a result of Nixon's maneuvers to secure peace terms, which the public was well aware of by this point, he gained the popular support and won the 1972 election, which we'll discuss more about in a minute. And it's noteworthy that voters in the 1972 election actually favored his Vietnam policy 2-1. Now, the ultimate end of the war occurred on January 27, 1973, when the Secretary of State Henry Kissinger signed an accord with Lee Duc Tho, who was the chief negotiator of North Vietnam, and this officially ended American participation in the war. The terms of the treaty basically gave the U.S. 60 days to withdraw its troops, and North Vietnam was allowed to keep forces in places which is currently occupied, which meant that 100,000 North Vietnamese soldiers remained in the South and could continue the war, and ultimately did continue the war after the Americans left. And as a result of this, the South could not hope to defeat the war. Ultimately, soon after this, North Vietnam entered Saigon. The South surrendered. Prior to this, the U.S. conducted several operations attempting to evacuate children from the South and also other individuals, but Saigon ultimately fell. And the war also caused another casualty besides the numerous people who died in the Vietnamese War, which I've given you at the bottom, the 1.5 million Vietnamese, both military and civilian, and the 58,000 U.S. troops. The other casualty which it created was a loss of consensus, confidence, and a sense of high moral ground in American political culture. America would never be the same again after the Vietnamese War, nor would its position in the world. Now this ultimately brings us to the election of 1972, which, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, was extremely controversial in a number of ways and also contributed to the downfall of America in terms of its moral high ground. Now, to avoid corruption, the process of selecting delegates for the Democratic National Convention was actually redesigned prior to the 1972 election. Basically, what it did was it awarded delegates based on a candidate's performance in a state primary or in the state primaries. A candidate who won no primaries couldn't receive the party's nomination to be the presidential candidate, and it ultimately gave a voice to people who voted in the primaries and reduced the influence of party leaders and power brokers. The reason for this reform was ultimately the 1968 election, in which an individual who had not won any of the primaries was ultimately given the Democratic Party nomination. This was extremely unpopular in the Democratic Party. It divided the party, and the Democratic Party wanted to get away from this. As a result of the efforts that the Democratic Party made, a woman by the name of Shirley Chisholm, who was African American, received 156 votes for the Democratic nomination on the first ballot at the Democratic National Convention. And she eventually did not get the nomination. It went to a man by the name of George McGovern, who was a strong opponent of the of the Vietnamese War. But this was a great step in the right direction, both for women and for African Americans in the country. Now, ultimately, George McGovern was not extremely popular, and many Democrats refused to support him. There were allegations that he supported women's right to abortion, which many Democrats did not agree with. There were allegations that he supported the decriminalization of drug use, and this also went in the face of suburbia and the South. And as a result of this, many people also switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party during this period. Moreover, McGovern's running mate was not free from any issues from his past. In fact, information came out that Daniel Ellsberg, who was his running mate during this period, underwent electroshock therapy for depression. This caused a minor scandal, and as a result of this, he withdrew, and it made McGovern even look more disorganized and unappealing than before. Now, ultimately, Nixon and the Republicans, in spite of all the efforts that the Democrats made in terms of reforming their primary system and looking for a better candidate to serve the American people, the Nixon and Republicans ultimately led from the start. And to increase their advantage, they attempted to paint McGovern as a radical leftist who favored amnesty for draft dodgers. They also did a lot of other things. And as a result of this, Nixon won very decisively. He won 520 to 17 electoral votes in this election. Now here's a picture of Shirley Chisholm and George McGovern. As I mentioned before, Shirley was the first African American woman ever to run for president in the nation. Now, ultimately, Nixon's victory in the 1972 election was very short-lived because it was soon discovered that he and members of his administration had engaged in unethical and illegal behavior during his first term. In fact, following the publication of the Pentagon Papers, a group of individuals known as the Plumbers, which I've given you here, which was a group of men used by the White House to spy on the president's opponents and stop leaks to the press, broke into the office of David Ellsberg, psychologist, and as I mentioned before, David Ellsberg was the vice presidential running mate of George McGovern. And they broke in to steal Ellsberg's file and learn information that they might use to damage his reputation. Apart from this, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which was nicknamed CREEP, which is kind of ironic in a number of ways, also played dirty during this period. The most notorious effort that they made was a break-in at the offices of the Democratic National Committee in Watergate, or the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., plus the subsequent cover-up of this break-in. Now, ultimately, this all began on June 17, 1972, when the police arrested 5 men at the office complex. According to the plan, the men were supposed to wiretap the Democratic National Convention's telephones, or the Democratic National Committee's telephones. And connections between these burglars that the police had arrested and CREEP soon began to arise. And on October 1972, the FBI revealed evidence of illegal intelligence gathering by CREEP for the purpose of sabotaging the Democratic Party. Now, it's noteworthy that Nixon won the election in November, and this information was not available to the public at this point. However, it was the beginning of the end for Nixon. Now, here's a photograph of the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex in Washington, D.C. Now, in the weeks following the Watergate break-in, reporters from the Washington Post received anonymous information from a man by the name of Deep Throat, who ended up being an FBI agent, about the break-in, and began digging deeper into the reported account. Now, initially, Nixon was able to hide his connection to the wrongdoings of CREEP, but by early 1973, the situation had really unraveled. By the summer of 1973, in fact, John Dean, who was the White House counsel and very close to the president, testified under oath that Nixon was involved in the conspiracy. Now, Nixon ultimately denied this. However, several individuals from the administration were convicted. And it's noteworthy that the investigation might have ended there were it not for the testimony of a relatively minor individual in the Nixon administration named Alexander Butterfield. Now, in Alexander Butterfield's testimony, he said that a voice-activated recording system had been installed in the Oval Office to record all of the president's conversations in case minutes needed to be referenced in the future. Now, the Senate immediately subpoenaed these tapes. However, Nixon refused to give them up and cited executive privilege in the process. Ultimately, this did not stop Congress from moving further. In December, the House Judiciary Committee began an investigation to determine whether enough evidence was there to impeach the president. By this point, the public was completely enraged. It seemed that the president, in the public's eyes, had placed himself above the law. And in April 1974, Nixon agreed to release transcripts of the tapes, but the action was ultimately too little too late. Now, it's noteworthy that in the transcripts, it revealed nothing about Nixon's knowledge of Watergate, but it did show him to be a coarse, dishonest, and cruel individual because of the language that he used. However, in July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee ultimately voted to begin impeachment proceedings on the president. However, before the vote, the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release the actual tapes, not just the transcripts, and one tape actually revealed that Nixon had been told about White House involvement in the Watergate break-in shortly after it occurred, thus proving that Nixon was aware of it. On August 5th, 1974, Nixon gave a speech to the American people, pleading that he wasn't a crook and that he had poor memory, but he did accept blame for the Watergate scandal. And after warnings that he could be found guilty by the Senate, he decided to resign on August 8th, 1974. And ultimately, this resulted in a lot of suspicion in the American public about what the government was doing, and it forever changed the face of the president in the United States of America. Now here is a photograph from Nixon's speech about the tapes which he made before his resignation on August 8th. Now, ultimately, President Gerald R. Ford was appointed president after Nixon's resignation, and he took office on August 9th, one day after Nixon resigned. Now, he wanted to quickly move the nation past the Watergate scandal, and one of his first actions was actually to grant Nixon a full pardon. The public was completely outraged by this because they wanted him to be tried for any potential illegal actions that he did. And ultimately, this action haunted Ford when he chose to run in the 1976 election. Now, as president, President Ford was confronted with a lot of great economic issues which had really been neglected during the whole Watergate scandal, namely inflation, a depressed economy, and energy shortages in the country. One of the things that Ford did to deal with inflation was the Whip Inflation Now campaign, which was abbreviated WIN. And basically what this did was it tried to encourage smart consumer purchases and also encourage individuals in the United States to have more savings to combat inflation. However, all of Ford's economic policies ultimately proved unsuccessful, and his foreign policies were also limited. Now, it's noteworthy that Ford continued Nixon's policy of détente with the Soviets, basically demilitarizing and getting rid of nuclear weapons and nuclear arsenals. He did make progress with the second round of the SALT talks, which we talked about before. And it's noteworthy that in August 1975, he also went to Finland and signed the Helsinki Accords with the Soviet premier at the time, Leonid Brezhnev. Essentially what the Helsinki Accords were was that they accepted the territorial boundaries which had been established at the end of the Second World War in 1945. And they also exacted a pledge from the signatory nations that they would protect human rights in their countries. Moreover, it also did a number of other things. However, it's noteworthy that immigrants from the Soviet-occupied countries who lived in the United States protested the actions that Ford made, and others really considered it to be a belated American acceptance of the world as it was, and a attempt, or no further attempt by the United States to engage with the spread of communism. Now here's a picture of Gerald Ford actually giving his full pardon to Richard Nixon, or a speech regarding the full pardon. And this brings us to the final president which we're going to discuss today. There's 4 more slides left in this lecture. Namely, Jimmy Carter and the election of 1976. Now, Ford ultimately won the Republican nomination, and the Democrats nominated Jimmy Carter, who ran on an anti-Washington ticket. Basically, what he was saying is that his lack of experience in federal politics — he was the governor of Georgia before this — was a virtue because he was not involved in the corrupt political system which had existed in politics prior to this point. In his campaign, Carter pledged to combat racism and sexism and also overhaul the tax structure. And he also proclaimed faith as a born-again Christian and promised to change the welfare system and other social reforms. However, most importantly, he promised he would never lie, unlike his predecessor, Richard Nixon. Now, ultimately, Carter won the vote in a very close election, 297 to 240. And while he was president, he was fairly conservative, particularly in domestic issues. His tax reform measure of 1977 was pretty weak. He did actually deregulate major issues, or major industries, such as aviation and trucking. And the intention behind this was to force large companies to become more competitive. And the consumers actually did benefit from this. In fact, the airlines, as a result of competition, created cheaper fares to beat competitors. However, it also drove other companies out of business, such as Pan American World Airways. During his presidency, he also expanded social programs such as housing for the elderly, etc. And he also created the Department of Energy for the first time, which was instituted to conserve energy in the United States and also seek out clean energy or alternative energy that could be used instead of gasoline. Now, Carter, in terms of foreign policy, basically believed that foreign policy should be founded on moral principles and national values, unlike many of the actions which have been taken by previous presidents and his predecessors. He actually improved relations with China during this period, and he also ended military support for the Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza. He also held talks with the Soviet Union during this period. However, it's noteworthy that he also boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow if the USSR did not retreat from Afghanistan, which it had invaded in 1979, and thus flew in the face of the treaty which was previously signed by Gerald R. Ford. This was not a popular decision, and ultimately the United States did boycott the Olympics. But it was really not followed by any of its international partners, which it had asked to join the boycott. However, the most noteworthy of Carter's foreign affairs was the Camp David Accords in September of 1978, which eventually resulted in a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979. Now, the most notorious foreign policy issue that Carter dealt with during his presidency was the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, the United States had long supported the Shah of Iran, who was notorious for being brutal and too Western, and a lot of the more conservative individuals in Iran did not like that. It angered the revolutionaries after he was overthrown in 1979. And in November 4th of 1979, students and activists actually invaded the American embassy in Tehran and seized 68 embassy employees. The women and African Americans were soon released, leaving 53 men as hostages. Ultimately, negotiations between the revolutionaries and Carter failed. Moreover, in April of 1980, there was also a failed rescue attempt when the aircraft which was sent to rescue the hostages crashed. And ultimately, this one point, the Iranian hostage crisis, ultimately really hurt Carter's presidential bid. And in fact, the hostages were finally released on January 20th, 1981, which was the exact day that Ronald Reagan took office as the next president of the United States of America. Now, before we end the lecture, here are a couple of pictures. First of all, here are the Camp David Accords with the leader of Egypt and the leader of Israel. And here are the return of the hostages from Iran as they arrive back in the United States after a long period of time in the Iranian nation. Now, the next lecture will start looking at the presidency of Ronald Reagan, which started a new era in American history.